Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth webinar in a series of 8 for the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online adaptation communities of practice. And those are run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources. And we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after the short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 40 minutes or so. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have some time left for any questions that you might have for the presenter. So if you have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. And before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted, and the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So to ask a question during the question and answer period, all you'll have to do is dial *6, and that will unmute your lines, but please do keep them muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. If you can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenter during the question and answer period. As well, if you run into any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can also use this chat area to type your message, or you can actually click on my name and send me a private message, and I can try to help you as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today. I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all of those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the Community of Practice website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACoP, is. So I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are working in the forestry field or who are just interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It includes features such as news articles, events, an online library, discussion forums, and much more. So it's free to join. So if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACoP, please just click on the link in the chat box for more information and to register. So with that being said, I'm very honored to introduce Luc Savard, who is on the line with us today to talk about an impact analysis of climate change and adaptation policies on the forestry sector in Quebec, a dynamic macro-micro framework. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Luc is a professor in the Department of Economics at Sherbrooke University in Quebec and is the founding director of the university's Groupe de recherche en économie et développement international. And before joining Sherbrooke University, Luc was a team leader for the IDRC-led program called the Micro Impacts of Macroeconomics and Adjustment Policies, or MIMAP, for 5 years in Dakar, Senegal. He also spent 7 years as a research associate at Laval University, has been a visiting professor at the University of Auvergne in France since 2009, and was an invited professor at the University of Montpellier in France during the academic year of 2013-2014. Luc has published extensively in various fields of economics, such as environmental and natural resources, development, public expenditure and public finance, as well as poverty analysis. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Luc, for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. It's very, very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you. Luc, if you're there.
Yes.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Well, I'd first like to thank Annette and FACoP for giving me the opportunity to make this seminar, webinar. It's first experience for me doing a webinar, so I hope it goes fairly well throughout the presentation. So I'll first start by saying that the project was funded by Uranos and the Natural Resource Ministry Department in Quebec. And we were 5 people working on this project. I had my 2 colleagues, Professor Dorothée Bocampuzo and Jonathan Goyette, and we had a research assistant, Véronique Gosselin, that helped us out, as well as Clovis Tanicou, who did his master's thesis basically on the subject. I could along. So originally, in fact, we started working on this project in relation to the interest of Uranus to expand their research agenda on economic and social dimension of adaptation to climate change. So they invited professors working on environmental issues in the province to submit projects. And in fact, we submitted this idea of researching the impact of climate change and adaptation policies on the forest industry in Quebec. In fact, the idea came in part from the report produced by the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, where they found a relatively large impact of climate change on the forest industry in Quebec, and there was an economist at Uranus who was a bit surprised by this result and found our proposal interesting to see if we would reproduce the similar results in the province. We'll come back to these results a little later on in the presentation. So I'll quickly, in the general context, I think most of you are very familiar with these issues, so I won't go into much detail. Basically, a lot of studies have shown that the climate change will have a large impact on the forest industry as well as communities and the industry, the broader forest industry. A lot of studies have also shown that world markets will be affected by climate change. And there is interest to understand the impact of adaptation programs to counter or to adapt to these climate change. Basically, our study had two main objectives. The first one was to analyze the distributive impact and economic impact of climate change on the forest industry in the province of Quebec, on the impact on various macroeconomic variables, sectoral variables, and also to investigate a couple of adaptation programs and see how they affected the economy and the change in the income distribution in the province. Before doing our constructing our model, we did a literature review, and we found a fair amount of studies that investigated the issue. Initially, these studies used partial equilibrium analysis, basically focusing solely on the forest industry, not taking into account the links of the forest industry with the rest of the economy. So I have some examples here where for some applications in Canada, there were some global models that were also built to analyze the impact of climate change on the forest industry. A little later on, about 10 years ago, there are some researchers, namely Reeve, Anheim, and Hodge, who used the global trade analysis project model to analyze the impact of climate change on the forestry industry. And later, a few years ago, there were authors that did applications for Canada in which Quebec was a region, but it wasn't a Quebec model, but a Canadian model with sub-regions to analyze the same issue. The framework we use is a little bit different from what others have used, in the sense that we extend from the methodology where we added a micro simulation model to the framework. This micro simulation model allows us to do distributive analysis, which other studies didn't do in the previous analysis. Basically, we used for our analysis dynamic, recursive dynamic, computable general equilibrium model. Without going into great detail, these types of models are models that model all the interaction that take place in the economy between different agents, the households, the firms, the government, the rest of the world, and between the different branches of the economy. It also captures the trade with the rest of the world. We also constructed a micro-simulation model with dynamic components, and we linked these two models with a top-down approach. I'll come back to that a little later on. And the last step of our analysis was to apply distributive analysis. So we used the most commonly used indicators for distributive analysis, the Foster-Greer-Torbeck indices for poverty analysis, and the Gini indices for income distribution change. Our starting point to build our model was a model we had built for to analyze the impact of massive investment that the government did in the province on infrastructure. We use that model as a starting point because some of the adaptation programs we analyzed included infrastructure, so it had the features useful to capture the effect of some adaptation programs. I'll come back to that later in the presentation. The main features of the model, we model production with two main production factors. So the production is done with capital and labor. There's also intermediate inputs that enter into production. There are four main agents in the model: households, firms, government, and rest of the world. And we had initially, the initial model, 25 sectors. The publicly available data to build these types of models are input-output tables, and they're only available up to 25 sectors in terms of disaggregation, even if they are more disaggregated versions, but they're not publicly available. The initial model had 10 periods, so it was a dynamic model, but ranging only over 10 periods or 10 years. And it, as I mentioned, there were features in the model to capture the productivity effects of infrastructure on other sectors of the economy. To model or to capture or to capture the features we wanted from the forestry industry, we had to make many changes in the model, and I'll go through some of these changes. The first change we had to introduce in our initial model was to disaggregate the database, which is called the social accounting metric. We had to basically go from 25 sectors to 30 sectors, and basically we extracted the sectors of the forestry industry. The final result allowed us to have the forestry and logging sector support activity for forestry, sawmill and wood preservation, other wood product manufacturing, pulp and paper manufacturing, and furniture and related product manufacturing. This part of the project was probably the most difficult one to achieve because of the difficulty in gathering the data to construct or to disaggregate our initial database. We had planned on working on this for about 3 months. It took about a year to disaggregate our database to be able to build our model from this. The main changes we introduce into the model are changes into the production of the forestry sector. The traditional functions that are used in the standard CG model did not reflect well how production is done in the forestry sector, and basically we tried to capture some of the features that we had observed and information we got from our steering committee, basically people from this working specialists of the forest industry that help us design that part of the model. So basically, we captured the fact that the productivity, marginal productivity of factors are changes as the amount of wood that is logged. So we capture that with some mathematical functions such as the Weibull function Leontief and Cobb-Douglas function. We also introduced the fact that every year the government, the Natural Resource Department fixes a maximum amount of wood that can be harvested. So we introduced that as a maximum stock of wood available for logging in the model, and that evolves in time based on the numbers or the figures that we obtained from the Department of Natural Resource Quebec. Basically, the production function is an S-shaped function which captures this maximum amount of wood that's available, and the fact that the productivity changes as we go along, or as we move up the production function, or the amount of wood that's logged during the year. So basically, this mathematical function represents the evolution of production in the sector. In the model, we also have a feature where we can capture the positive effect of infrastructure on private sector. Namely, in our case, we're interested in the link between the infrastructure that's going to be tied to the adaptation programs with the production, the productivity of the forestry sector. We used hypothesis from the book Confuso and Al paper on the infrastructure in Quebec model. And we also estimated the degree of sensitivity between the investment in infrastructure and the productivity effect in the sector. So we did some estimation specific for the province of Quebec. We used Canadian and Quebec data to do that. We also introduced another feature in the model which allows us to provide different destination for wood chips that are produced by the forestry sector. In fact, the wood chip can be used in the pulp paper industry, can be exported to the rest of the world, although this share is quite small, but it can also be used for production of energy. Cogeneration production of energy is also a consumer of these wood chips. So we introduced features in the model that capture this market feature in the Quebec economy. As for the growth in the model, it's relatively standard as these type of dynamic, recursive dynamic model. Basically, the growth in the economy takes place with an accumulation of capital. The accumulation of capital in the economy depends on the amount of savings in the economy. The destination of the investment goes to the sectors that are most productive or have a highest return on capital. The labor force grows at the same pace as the growth of population in the province. So these are pretty standard features. That part of the model is quite standard. We had other variables that did a number of variables, exogenous variable in the model, grow at the same rate as the population grows, but others for which we had information on the rate of growth that was different than this population growth rate was adapted. For example, we made the public expenditure grow at the rate that was observed for 5 years in the province, which is 3.2% per year, which is much higher than the population growth rate, which is at 0.7% per year. Basically, to run our dynamic model, before we perform our simulation, we run what we call a business as usual scenario, and we calibrated the growth rate for the 40 years of our model at 2% per year. The choice of 2% is not key in our results as we compare our simulation with this calibrated business as usual scenario. We could have used a 1% growth rate, but the results don't change, are not sensitive to the choice of this growth rate that we selected. In fact, that we selected it because it represented the growth rate of the province and the GDP growth rate of the province in the last 10 years, prior to the reference period of our model. As for the link between infrastructure and productivity, basically the idea is to say that when you increase infrastructure, for example, road infrastructure, you increase here. There's a theta parameter. This parameter increases with increases in public infrastructure, and as this parameter at the reference period is at equal to 1, and this parameter comes in at this point here in the production function and multiplies the other factors in the production function and allows for a gain in productivity. So if the investment in public infrastructure simply replaces or repairs the road, the parameter will be equal to 1. If there's an improvement in public infrastructure, you get a gain in productivity in other sectors. As I mentioned previously, the elasticity that we have here was estimated on data from the province here, and it's specific to each sector in the economy. Our micro simulation model that's used to perform the distributive analysis, we first had to build it from micro household data. We used the structure of income of household, the structure of expenditure of household, and we also compute the change in welfare. We call it equivalent variation. So this equivalent variation captures the income and price effect of a policy or an external shock on households. We also introduced, and this is one of our main contributions in the model, is introducing some dynamic components that are not usually introduced in these models. So we have growth of capital taking place, and that I'll come back to that. And we also have demographic changes introduced in our micro simulation model. We needed to add a link between what is the computable general equilibrium model, which is more of a macro model, and the micro model. And there are different approaches. I'll come back to that in a few slides. The growth of capital basically in the model is a function of household savings. So basically, the growth of capital taken from the macro model is brought back into the micro simulation, micro household model, and the households that benefit from this growth in capital are the households with the highest savings rate. The ones with the lower savings rate will not benefit from this growth of capital that is generated by the growth in the economy. In general, what people do is they just distribute uniformly across households this growth of capital. So we go further than that to capture some specificities we had in the micro database. In terms of demographic changes, since our model is run over 40 years, the structure of the population will change during that time. So what we did, we used the statistics office in Quebec's estimate of change in structure for 20 years and 40 years, and we applied the Devil and Sarndal approach to re-weight the households in order that the demographic structure of a population reflects the estimates of the statistics office. So we have an evolution of the structure of our population as time goes by. The database was constructed from the survey of household spending, and we needed to do a mapping so that the decomposition of expenditure was the same as the decomposition we had in our social accounting matrix. So basically, the micro data needed to be compatible with the macro data. We needed to balance the income and expenditure for each household that we had in our model. The income function of each household in the microsimulation model changes with changes of the wage that's obtained from the CGE model. The capital payment also affect the income, and the growth of assets is also endogenous and makes the income change. As for the expenditure, each simulation produces a new income, as I just explained, and we also have market prices for all the goods consumed. So these two elements combine to change the welfare of the household, and we can measure that change in welfare with the equivalent variation. So for each simulation, we have a new vector for each household, which allows us to do distributive analysis of changes in income or changes in welfare for our household. We compute our poverty indices and our income distribution indices. To link the two models, there are various approaches that are available in the literature. We use the best one for our analysis in the sense that, in fact, in dynamic models, the only one we've seen in the literature was the top-down approach, so we used that top-down. The other ones would have required more complex modeling than what we did here. So what we do, we link the models. We don't link the models for each period or each year. Don't perform the distributive analysis at every period. We could do it, but it would provide for a very large amount of results. So we concentrated on the distributive impact after 20 years and after 40 years in our model. The design of the scenario was another part of the project that was a bit longer than what we initially expected, but it was a very interesting process to design the scenario. Basically, we sent out a proposal to the member of our steering committee, and they provided us feedback on the scenarios we had designed to make sure that the scenarios reflected to what was expected by people in the industry. So we had some people from Uranus that gave us a lot of feedback, and the forestry economists from the Department of Natural Resources were very helpful in helping us design our scenarios that we implemented in our model. In fact, the other elements that we use for at least for our first proposal, we looked at the ecological models, general circulation models for evaluation of changes in productivity of forests. We also looked at other applications of CG models analyzing the impact of climate change on forestry. For the adaptation scenario, we used a paper by Madame Gauthier, Natural Resource Canada, where she did with her colleagues, they did a very broad survey of close to 200 adaptation programs that were either discussed or implemented around the world. So we use these to help us design some of our two of our scenarios, or in fact, some of our scenarios that we implement. Here is a table in which we present a summary, not a summary, but the presentation of our scenarios that we implemented in the model. I will not present all of these results. It makes for a lot of results. We have results over 40 periods for over 15 scenarios. So I'll concentrate on 5 of the scenarios. The first one is an increase in productivity of 3%. The second is a decrease in productivity, forest productivity of 3%. The third one is a decrease in forest productivity of 6%. The fourth simulation is an adaptation program, and the adaptation program here is linked to any adaptation program that is targeted at infrastructure. It could be forest roads or anything. It could be bridges, forest bridges, or whatever, but infrastructure. So it involves constructing something that will help the productivity of the forest sector. The second type of adaptation program that we capture are subsidies through the forestry support sector. So all the programs that are targeting or are aimed at reducing the cost of the forestry support sector that will eventually help in improving productivity of the forest could be included in this simulation. So there were a number of adaptation programs that could be included from the Gauthier paper, Gauthier and Al paper, that could be included in these two adaptation programs. We did not cover all the 200 adaptation programs because some were difficult to convert into simulations that we could perform in the model. That was our main limitations in choosing the adaptation program we simulated. So if we look at some of our results, these results are very brief. I don't go into detail. We had a lot of results because we have a lot of variables in the model, did a lot of simulation. So basically the way to read the simulation, if I take the first graph here is for the third simulation, so a 6% reduction in forest productivity. And what we have here, the line that we have here, is the gap between our business as usual scenario and the scenario we perform. So basically what we have here is that we have a reduction in the GDP compared to our business as usual scenario. So the reduction is progressive. The slope increases as we move along in time. And after 40 years, if we look here, we're at we have a reduction in GDP of about 0.075 after 40 years. We have a similar trend for our different agent income. The government income is in blue here, and the firm's income is in green here. So these are the worst affected in terms of income. Their impact is stronger than the impact on GDP. For government, it's weaker than what we observe on GDP. We also have the debt, the public debt that increases. It doesn't increase by that much, but it increased by about 2.5% compared to, in fact, for our business as usual scenario, the public debt was held constant for 40 years. The forestry sector, as we see here, are the ones the most affected by this. It's not surprising because they are the ones directly affected. So the forestry and logging sector, the production drops by almost 5%. It doesn't drop as much as the 6% drop in productivity, but it drops by a fair amount. The other two sectors are wood product and sawmills and wood preservation, which the production dropped more than 2% after 40 years. The other sectors tied to the forestry industry, what's interesting is that we have the forestry support sector that increases. In fact, as the productivity decreases, there's more demand to improve, to use the forestry support sector to help attenuate the loss in productivity given the adaptation without any subsidy. This is done, the demand increases as the productivity decreases. For the other sectors, we also observe a decrease, but the decrease, well, the pulp and paper drops for around 0 or a quarter percentage point, but the other sectors don't decrease that much. What's also interesting is that we have an effect on other sectors in the economy. Some sectors benefit from the drop, namely the other manufacturing sector, which benefits from the reduction in productivity of the forestry sector. Basically, since the returns are better in that sector, there's more investment that goes to that sector. But the retail sector and the finance sector see their production drop with the reduction in productivity of the forestry sector. So basically, there are some sectors that benefit from the negative impact on productivity of the forestry sector, and some sectors benefit. So we have here we only represented 3 sectors. We have I think it's 17 other or 16 other sectors that we could have presented, but we couldn't have read, or the graph would have been clogged with lines. So here we concentrated on the largest. In fact, 3 sectors represent 50% of the GDP in Quebec. Moving quickly, I don't have a lot of time left, but moving quickly to the adaptation program. Just quickly, I won't go into detail for each graph, but if we look at the GDP, what we did here, we decomposed we reproduced the simulation 2, which was a reduction of 3% drop in productivity. So this is the blue line here is the simulation 2, and the simulation 4 is the green line. And the red line is the adaptation program without the productivity reduction. So basically, the final result is this green line here. So basically, what we see is that the adaptation program in this case was efficient in attenuating most of the negative impact, at least up to the 30th year. After that, we see a drop below the business as usual. But it was efficient in reducing the negative impact of negative productivity of climate change. If we look at the forestry industry, we see a similar trend here with a positive impact. In fact, after a while, the productivity gains drop in time, since the infrastructure program doesn't last for 40 years, it lasts for 5 years, if my memory serves right. Same thing here for the productivity of other sectors. The gains for the manufacturing sector is larger here than what we observed in the previous simulation. Moving on to the other here adaptation program, we have an effect that's quite different. In this case, the gains, the productivity gains, which is the green line, combining the two is the green line here. So basically, the program attenuates the effect, but the gains take a much longer time. As I can recall, here it's the adaptation program that's targeting the forestry support sector. So the returns take much longer to kick in the economy. So the gains are positive here. For the red line, direct gains are positive, but they take longer to take place in the economy. I'll move on to the distributional result. Basically, we can concentrate on this part here, where we have the impact for the whole economy, the whole population of Quebec. So the first simulation, where we have an increase in productivity, we have a reduction in poverty here after 20 years, and a larger one after 40 years, more than double. The reduction in productivity produces an increase in poverty. As you will notice, the impact on poverty are relatively small, but what's interesting is that these are small but significant, statistically significant changes in poverty. If we look at adaptation program, the adaptation program was applied to the simulation 2. So basically, in this case, the simulation or the adaptation program is not efficient in reducing poverty. In fact, it increases poverty compared to simulation 2. As for the last simulation, which is the adaptation program targeting the forestry support sector, this one is efficient in reducing poverty compared to simulation 2 here. And basically, we have almost no change in poverty for this simulation. We also have resolved here for different types of communities, basically the larger cities of larger than 100,000, the smaller communities, and rural areas. So we have effects in the rural areas that are much smaller, but are different. We have different. The effects go in different directions. The rural areas compared to the urban areas. Quickly, inequality changes. We have similar effect, but instead of a reduction in poverty, we have for the first simulation we have an increase in inequality with the gains in productivity, a reduction in inequality when the productivity drops, and similar effect. The two adaptation programs have effects going in different directions. So here we increase inequality, we decrease inequality a little bit more than simulation 2, and increase inequality for the last adaptation program. So let me move to the concluding remarks. We know that the climate change will have an impact on the forestry sector. It could be positive or negative. We don't. Here we look at the two options. If it's a positive impact, we'll have a positive impact on the forestry sector. A negative impact on productivity will have a negative impact. However, the relative size of the effect are quite small. The impact we measured, given the simulations we performed, in the worst case scenario on GDP, we had an impact that would reduce GDP by around 260 million after 40 years. And in our most positive scenario, we had an increase in GDP of 129 million over 40 years. So these are relatively small change. And if we compare to some other applications, our results were weaker than what others have found in their model. Some explanations for the relatively small impact on the rest of the economy is that the relative size of the sector is not as big as it was, and that reduces its trickle effect to the rest of the economy. In our model, we allow for factor reallocation over time. So workers reallocate to other sectors when they're laid off. We have unemployment in our model. I didn't focus the results on that, but in time, the workers reallocate to other sectors of the economy. We have a fair amount of flexibility in our economy to try to reflect what we observed in reality. Most studies have found a stronger impact. In some cases, it can be explained by less flexible behavior in models, especially the models which input output or partial equilibrium model tend to find stronger effects than what CG models will generally find. It's interesting also to find that other sectors are affected in the rest of the economy, which justifies using a general equilibrium model compared to partial equilibrium model. For the distributive analysis, we had small changes, but they were significant changes. And another interesting finding is the adaptation program did not have the same type of effect in the economy, but also in terms of distributive analysis. What next? In fact, we have a few ideas for extension of this research. One idea, many people have suggested that we should combine the simulation with the impact on agriculture. Some people are disappointed that our effects are so small, so they'd like us to have stronger effects. So including agricultural sector, or the impact of climate change on agricultural sector could increase the effects that we have on the economy. A lot of people throughout our study suggested that we decompose hardwood and softwood because one of the impact of climate change will be the change in structure of the forest with more hardwood and less softwood. But the problem with going in this direction is the availability of data. We started investigating the possibility of decomposing two sectors, but it would require an enormous amount of work to gather the data, to decompose our database to capture these two subsectors of forestry industry. We could also improve our estimates of the impact of adaptation program on forest productivity. And there's some work we want to do on our micro-simulation namely to have endogenous labor supply in our micro-simulation model. We do have the endogenous labor supply in our CG model, but not in our micro-simulation. So I'll stop my presentation here. I exceeded my time by about 5 minutes, but there's still some time for questions.
Great. Okay, thanks, Luc. So yeah, we do have about 15 minutes left for any questions. So before we get started, I just want to mention, if you'd like to use the chat box, feel free to go ahead and type out your question and I can read it out for everyone. And if you're on the conference call line with us and would prefer to ask a question over the telephone, just hit *6 to unmute your line. So I see that there is a question in the chat box already. So Vic Pakalnis writes, wouldn't municipal sector be affected in addition to forestry, agriculture, buildings, etc.?
Certainly. And in fact, the roundtable had identified three main sectors: forestry, agriculture, and building. But there are other parts of the economy which will be affected. It's clear that if we want to have, in the paper, we didn't try to measure the impact on the economy of climate change. It's the climate change on forestry. Our results do not reflect the impact, the impact of climate change on the Quebec economy. It's a measure of only the part on the forestry. To measure, to be complete or have a good measure of impact of climate change, we need to include the impact on all sectors that would be affected negatively or positively.
Perfect, thank you. So I don't see anybody else typing a message. If there's anybody on the conference call line that has a question, just please unmute your lines and go ahead. Give everybody a few seconds here. While we're waiting for more questions, Luc, you have this posted somewhere online that people can access, the paper and other resources?
Yes, in fact, we have a version of the paper. The presentation should be available probably on the Uranus website, but we also have our paper, more detailed paper that's available on our web page for our research group. So it's gredi.org. In the working papers, it's listed there, so it's available, publicly available.
Okay, perfect. Maybe when I send out the follow-up email, I can include a link to that site for everybody. Okay, I see other people typing. Last call for anybody on the conference call line for questions. Okay, we'll give everybody a couple more seconds here. I know we have some time, so I don't want to cut anybody off in case there's some questions going around. Okay, so Vic has another question here. So did you see regional effects, northern counties in particular?
Okay, in fact, this is a good question. This is a point that was raised quite early in our when we started doing our work. we had the idea, or we had the suggestion to decompose the regions in Quebec, namely the forestry, more forestry-oriented regions, the more urban areas. But in fact, our data didn't allow us to do decomposition. So the only way we can see a regional effects is by looking at the sectorial effect. So we can only say, well, regions where there's a higher proportion of mining industry and forestry industry would be more penalized. But as the forestry industry is quite present in almost all of the province, if we take, for example, the region here in the Eastern Township, where it's a bit more urban than northern Quebec, the forestry industry is quite present. As there's some logging, there's some sawmills, there's some pulp and paper, even in Montreal and Quebec. So it's difficult. It wasn't possible, in fact, to decompose the province in sub-regions given the unavailability of data. In fact, we could have done it, but it would have taken about 2 years to construct these sub-regions.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. Last call for questions. Again, on the conference call line, if you have any questions, just hit *6 to unmute your line, and I'll give everybody a few seconds here. Okay, last call. Don't want to cut anybody off. Okay, well, if that's no more questions, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the webinar. We hope you enjoyed it, and obviously a very big thank you goes out to you, Luc, for your time and effort and for a great and informative presentation. Any last comments from you before we sign off here?
Oh, no special comments, just hi to my ex-colleague, Jared, that's still online. It's nice to see that you were there to hear my presentation.
Perfect. Okay, great. So thanks everybody for joining, and have a great week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luc. Bye-bye.